What do you do to follow up a game like Zero Mission? Do you make another remake of a game that's old and hard to appreciate and try to capitalize on its success? Or do you move things forward with another 2D game and expand upon what worked in Zero Mission? Well, the answer Nintendo came up with was to do neither. You see, at the time, Metroid was also starting to branch out from its 2D roots into 3D with the Prime series, which according to the timeline is the sequel to the original Metroid, which makes a lot of sense considering the game that we're going to be talking about today, but I digress. Nintendo decided to go further with the Prime series, making Prime 2 and going onwards to make games that would further Metroid's story rather than remaking an older title on newer hardware. While the Metroid series would go on to receive its fair share of praise and complaints during this time period, a problem that would remain with the series for years to come would be the severe feeling of gameplay whiplash when you finished playing Zero Mission, and then would have to track down and play Metroid 2 Samus Returns, the, for lack of a better term, sequel title released on the original Game Boy. Now, I've never played Metroid 2 myself, but I've also never heard anything spectacular about it, so I just decided to skip it and let the wiki pages inform me of what happened in between games. That is until 2017 when Mercury Studios hit the scene with a remake of Metroid 2 called Samus Returns for the 3DS. Despite not being a fan of the series, I was excited to hear that a new Metroid game had finally hit the scene after a near 10-year drought. And so, when I had gotten the money, I had purchased Samus Returns and put the game down 2 hours later. It took about 6 months for me to finish Samus Returns, in which the only reason I did finish it was because I, for lack of a better term, forced myself to do so. Now, don't get it twisted, I did enjoy Samus Returns a lot, but there was just something about it that didn't feel right. And after completing Zero Mission, I can better identify what it, or rather what those things were. What are those things? Well, you're gonna have to find out, because we're diving right into Metroid Samus Returns. Samus Returns takes place sometime after the events of Zero Mission, where it's revealed through the opening text narration that Mother Brain's plan from the last game was to replicate the Metroids and use their energy-draining powers for nefarious purposes. As a result of the impending threat the Metroids pose to all life, the Galactic Federation sent on a platoon of their own men to visit the Metroids' home planet, SR-388, and investigate them to see if they would continue to pose a problem. And wouldn't you know, shortly after the platoon touched down, all communications with them ceased, forcing the Galactic Federation to call on Samus once again, this time tasking her with the eradication of all Metroids. From here, this is where gameplay takes over, giving you control of Samus, who's notably depowered from the end of Zero Mission, losing all her suit upgrades, traversal abilities, and weapons, but still retains the long beam, power grip, and missiles, which the game starts you out with a generous 30 missiles, which is probably the biggest tone setter for how the adventure will go down this time around. Now, upon exploring SR-388, it doesn't take long to find that the planet has other inhabitants than the Metroids, and it's equally as fast to find out that these other inhabitants are really strong, as not only do they take way too many regular beam shots to take down, but they also deal eyebrow-raising amounts of damage to you early on. Heck, even in late game when you get all your energy tank upgrades and so on, you can't let your guard down around these guys because they'll maul you in seconds, giving Samus Returns the distinctive gameplay feature of, dude, where'd my health go? Now, to be fair, considering that we're on the Metroids' home planet, it would make sense that the other creatures that would inhabit it would be strong like them in order to hang in this environment. And despite SR-388 being inhabited by powerful snails, I guess, Samus is still Samus, being a living Swiss Army knife with a rocket attachment. And this time around, she has a new trick up her sleeve in the form of this parry. Activated by pressing the X button only when the enemy flashes white, Samus can turn their attack against them and from the counter unleash a much stronger beam attack that takes down most regular enemies within one hit. The counter attack in Samus Returns is quite the powerful tool, being able to trivialize many powerful enemies roaming around SR-388. However, it's because of this power is why I stand at odds with it. While Samus Returns does have the usual lineup of abilities that allow you to mow down enemies with ease, early on, the counter is your best bet for dealing with any and all enemies that come your way, which give the game a bit of a stop and go feel. Since you don't want to run into or get hit by any of these enemies, you'll wait for them to attack, which completely halts all your momentum. This led me to feel like I had already solved the game within the first 2 hours of playing Samus Returns, because this was the only effective and quick method I had to deal with enemies, aside from missiles, which I personally never use on regular enemies because I wanted to save them for boss fights. Because of how strong counters are, it made me want a more varied and diverse way of taking out enemies, which in writing the script for this video video, I thought I could easily suggest one of the later weapons in the game to give you early on, but due to how much stronger they are, you run into the opposite problem where nothing can really pose a challenge to you anymore. The only thing I can recommend giving the player is the plasma beam, as its added strength allows you to engage enemies instead of waiting for them to make a move, but it's not strong enough to completely invalidate them once you attack. Unrelated to the topic at hand, but I also noticed that, unlike Zero Mission, there wasn't any cool little details about the world for me to interact with, like those bugs that later destroy the orbs blocking my path. Now, don't get me wrong, there are cool environmental details, however, they are squarely in the background and won't affect anything happening in the foreground at all. Samus Returns is mostly focused on the combat, which I didn't realize at first when I played the game back in 2017, but now that I finished Zero Mission, I can see it all too clearly, and I miss it so much. The biggest reason as to why I like Zero Mission was thanks to how organic the world and enemy designs were, making a bunch of otherwise worthless enemies feel extremely lifelike. And thanks to Zero Mission opening my eyes as to how a traditional Metroid game worked, I'd hope to at least develop a similar appreciation for the world and enemies of Samus Returns. But I just couldn't. Enemies exist to be obstacles in your path like a 2D action game instead of feeling like creatures protecting their environment, which is a design choice that I can't exactly fault Mercury's team for, since they were following up the design of Metroid 2, which from the footage I've seen didn't exactly give them a whole lot to work with. As I stated earlier, the goal of Samus Returns is to eradicate Metroids, whereas the goal of Zero Mission was to find Mother Brain, then eliminate her alongside any Metroids in her base. Since you already know what Metroids are, at least in Samus Returns, which has the Metroid radar that beeps and flashes red whenever you're close to a Metroid, it only makes sense since you'll be encountering Metroid after Metroid to give it a more action-focused feel. And while the earlier half may have a lot to be desired, when I got to the halfway point, Samus Returns puts its foot on the gas and doesn't slow down for any reason, outright capitalizing on its new combat focus to give not only some of the best 2D Metroid game bosses I've played to date, which mind you at the time of writing this isn't a lot of them, but some of the best bosses I've faced in a 2D game in general. This all starts when you travel further into SR388 and come across your first Metroid, only to see that it evolved. Evolved Metroids are the major gimmick of Metroid 2/Samus Returns, putting a spin on the little monsters at the end of the first game and making them a whole lot more threatening as they lost their weakness to the cold. Now, even though evolved Metroids aren't weak to cold, they are still affected by it, just to a lesser extent than their original baby version, as they are still able to move around and attack. Although, somehow, in an act of de-evolution, the evolved Metroids are now affected by regular missiles without needing to freeze them. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but hey, it gives Samus a fighting chance against these monsters, and it's honestly the best way to take them out early and even in the late game. Now, there are 4, technically 6 types of Metroids you'll be encountering throughout the game. The new evolved form we just saw is known as the Alpha Metroids, and as you dive deeper into SR388, you'll come across the Gamma, Zeta, and Omega Metroids, all of which have a different level of pain they can dish out to you per evolution. Now, out of the 4 I just mentioned, Alpha and Gammas are going to be the Metroids you'll be encountering for a majority of the game, and in their abundance comes a lot of repetition. You see, when you boot up Samus Returns, you're already aware of the fact that there are 40 Metroids you need to take out in order to complete the game, indicated by the radar. And with there only being 4 types of Metroids to fight for a majority of the game, it's safe to say that you're going to get some repeats, and boy, are they the same. For about 25 fights, it's just Alphas and Gammas over and over, with the only big difference between each Metroid is a larger health pool, making the fights last a lot longer. It also doesn't help that once their health reaches a certain threshold, Gammas will just run away in the middle of a fight, traveling to one of the 2 nearby arenas, which honestly don't take up a lot of time, but when you're marathoning through the game and encounter 2 or 3 Gammas that run away from you mid-fight, it can get a little grating. Now, as for the Zetas and Omegas, their fights are a genuine breath of fresh air, as not only do their limited appearances make them all the more exciting to encounter, but their fights are a tad more complex than the ones that precede them. Thanks to their unorthodox movesets and patterns, you're going to have to use a lot more of your tools than just the ice beam and missiles to take them down. And this also goes for the non-Metroid bosses as well, forcing you to become mentally flexible in order to get past certain phases. While a number of your non-combative abilities are used throughout the later boss fights, the usage of the new Spider Ball is something that caught me off guard my first time through, as at a glance, it's just a move for traversing tall rooms. However, the game then starts throwing scenarios at you where you have to use a Spider Ball in the middle of a fight in order to stay ahead of the boss. The most obvious example of this is the excavator boss fight that has this vacuum attack that pulls you in towards it and deals massive damage to you. But if you use the spider ball, not only does the vacuum not affect you, you can deal damage to the boss as the vacuum will suck up the bombs. This was such a shock to my system when I first figured it out that I almost did a backflip learning that I could do this. It's such a cool detail to the game that you do in fact need to do to beat the boss, but from a storytelling perspective, it also makes Samus a lot more interesting and resourceful as a fighter, since she uses everything to her advantage, even her abilities that have no immediate effect on the enemy. Now, on the topic of abilities, there is something that I neglected to mention that's introduced in this game, being the Aeon powers. The Aeon powers are interesting for lack of a better term, as while they all give different utilities depending on which one you activate, I never really felt that they helped out too much in the grand scheme of things. The first Aeon power up to bat is the Scan Pulse, which is hands down the most useful of them all, as it not only reveals hidden areas on the map, but breakable blocks which could lead to hidden goodies or secret areas. Now, for as good as the Scan Pulse is, I feel that it's a double-edged sword, seeing as you basically have access to the Byakugan at all times, eliminating any need to investigate the environment. As a result, I actually don't remember much of anything about exploring SR388 since I never had to, which only helps the world feel that much more forgettable, at least to me. Next up is the Lightning Armor, which is the second most useful ability as it turns the Aeon meter into a temporary shield meter, allowing you to tank a couple of hits without your energy tanks being affected. In addition, the Lightning Armor also extends the range of your parry, which needless to say is pretty useful given the fact that Samus is a ranged fighter. Next is the Burst Beam, which on paper is really good as it deals a lot of damage to overwhelm the enemy, but in practice I hardly see results from it outside of enemies that are only affected by it. My problem with the Burst Beam is that it doesn't do enough damage to warrant using it, and in using it, it depletes the Aeon meter which I need for the Lightning Armor or Scan Pulse. Now, to be fair, the game provides you with way too many methods to gain back Aeon meter. The method you'll be using the most is actually the parry, as when successfully landed, Aeon orbs will fly out of the enemy, and even more so if you kill them with a stronger beam charge from said parry. So if you play the game right, you will have enough Aeon meter to use it, but with that being said, I just rather use super missiles which can decimate bosses no questions asked. The last of the Aeon powers is Phase Shift, which allows you to slow down time, and truth be told, outside of puzzles, I didn't use this one all too much, so how useful this power can really be is beyond my knowledge at the time of writing this video. All in all, I think the Aeon powers are pretty hit and miss, as while some of them have good uses, they aren't consistent enough across the board for me to say that they're good overall. I'm not actually sure what could be done about them to give them a better use in the game, aside from making the beam burst not eat through the Aeon meter, but that kinda defeats the purpose of the Aeon meter in the first place. I think the concept of giving Samus a non-ammo related Swiss Army knife to help her progress through the game is a really cool idea, it just needs a bit more fine tuning to get it to a place where all powers are useful and they don't actively attack each other for being used at the same time. But with that being said, I'm all out of things to talk about gameplay wise, so what do you say we head back into the story and wrap that up as well. After taking out 39 Metroids and making her way down to the 8th and final area of the game, Samus finds that 9 more Metroids suddenly sprang up out of nowhere, which turns out to be baby Metroids, who unlike their older siblings are still weak to the good old Ice Beam missile combo. But upon defeating the second to last Metroid, a roar comes from out of the blue, drawing Samus' attention to the center of the area where it's revealed that the final Metroid to beat is the mother of them all, Queen Metroid. This boss is nothing short of amazing, requiring that you use all your skills including spatial awareness in order to take Queen Metroid down, which, by the way, involves you running into her stomach so that you can hit her with a power bomb. And with possibly the most meta way to die, Queen Metroid is defeated. However, upon leaving, Samus encounters a newly born baby Metroid, to which after it imprints on Samus, she doesn't take it out. Instead, she takes it with her, seeing as it's not out to attack her, or any life form for that matter. Now, aside from being an admittedly cute companion, until you get back to the ship, the baby Metroid is, for lack of a better term, a mechanic used to get all the upgrades, as there will be certain walls that prevent your progression that only the baby Metroid can take away. It should be noted that not all areas with these walls are baby Metroid exclusive, as some of them just serve as shortcuts to the actual solution, which is a cool method of doing things. But for the few that are mandatory, it's just a pain to be forced to wait until endgame to collect these upgrades when there's only fodder left to use them on. With that being said, the trek back to the ship with the baby Metroid is kinda cute. I mean, in a literal sense, nothing happens, but it is kind of a bonding moment between Samus and the Metroid. You know, the enemy of the whole game, the species that you just spent the however many hours trying to destroy. It's kinda surreal how cute this all is despite the species-wide genocide Samus just committed. But as the two reach the surface, they make it in time to catch a storm brewing. But as they get closer to the ship, it turns out that the clouds were hiding Ridley's physical presence, who is kinda in between his mecha and actual self-incarnation as he tries to take the baby Metroid, initiating the real final boss of the game. This fight against Ridley is actually the best boss fight in the game. Not only is it a multi-layered slug match where all your concentration is needed to make it out alive, but it's also surprisingly cinematic, transitioning to a cutscene for every new phase to show how Samus is adapting to Ridley's attacks and vice versa. Like how Samus shoots Ridley's wing to ground him, but because Ridley's wing is made of the same material as Batman's cape, it proves to be partially effective at best. A cool detail used in this boss is the fact that Ridley's armor at the end of Zero Mission was impervious to all of Samus's attacks, requiring that you aim directly at his core to deal damage. And true to that game, Ridley's armor is still impervious to all of your attacks. In fact, he purposely uses the armor to his advantage for one of his charging attacks. And if that weren't enough, the baby Metroid helps you tag team Ridley by using its ability to absorb energy and gives it to Samus, replenishing her health. The amount you get isn't a lot considering the fact that Ridley's been pumping iron since his last encounter and now hits like a runaway train, but this is a really cool detail to the boss fight, as the Metroid's most infamous attack is now being used to keep you alive in the biggest fight of the game. You gotta love the dramatic irony. Thanks to their combined efforts, Ridley is defeated, allowing the two to leave SR-388, but in an after-credits scene, we see a gelatinous being attack one of the inhabitants of the planet and change it into something more vicious looking. What does it mean? Play Fusion. And that was Metroid Samus Returns, a really good game that starts out with an admittedly slow beginning, but I urge anyone who hasn't tried the game out to power on through, as in terms of combat and the boss fights, the latter half of the game is leaps and bounds better than what came before it. Still, with that being said, I know this is harder to get around because Samus Returns is a remake of Metroid 2, so it had to play by certain constraints, but maybe lessening the Metroids from 40 to 35 may have done the trick for the pacing. I know it's not a lot different, but it does make getting to the second half of the game a lot quicker, so there is that. And hey, if you're interested in picking up a copy of Samus Returns, you're in luck because it's one of the few Metroid games you can purchase without breaking the bank, thanks to the game releasing on previous gen hardware. So it's not disgustingly expensive, it's just moderately expensive, which is technically better. But factually, I can tell you, if you play this game, you're in for a good time.